Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is FixerMed, and welcome back to my high-yield biochemistry review series for the USMLE Step 1, NBME CBSE, and NBME CAS Examination series. This will be part 7 of a multi-part video series detailing the entire discipline of biochemistry in a high-yield review format. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So in today's review video, we're going to be covering familial dyslipidemias, starting off with hyperchylomicronemia. The classic form of it is mainly inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion. The secondary form of it may result from insulin resistance in conditions like diabetes. The main defect seen in the classical form of hyperchylomicronemia is deficiency of lipoprotein lipase, also known as LPL, or its cofactor apolipoprotein C2. In the secondary form, the main defect seen is impaired LPL function or decreased production of apolipoprotein C2. The main clinical features seen in hyperchylomicronemia are elevated triglyceride levels, predominantly due to elevated chylomicrons, eruptive xanthomas, which are small yellowish papules or nodules on the skin, hepatosplenomegaly, which is basically a enlarged liver and spleen due to accumulation of chylomicrons, abdominal pain due to pancreatitis, which is a significant risk due to hypertriglyceridemia. Hyperchylomicronemia is also known as hyperlipoproteinemia type 1, HLP1, and the plasma appears creamy is a good giveaway for hyperchylomicronemia on CBSE exams. You won't see it as much on Step 1 exams since they're moving away from the buzzword association, but the CBSE should still give you these buzzwords. I'll be making separate videos on buzzwords you'll see on the CBSE in a later video series. So moving on to the next set of dyslipidemias we'll be covering. So we have familial hypercholesterolemia. Try saying that real fast 3 times. Is inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. The main defects seen in it is mutations in the LDL receptor gene or the apolipoprotein B100 gene. The main clinical features seen are elevated LDL cholesterol levels, increased risk of premature atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular disease. Also can see tendon xanthomas, especially the Achilles tendon. Next we have hypoalpha-proteinemia. This can be inherited in a multiple variety of ways. It's polygenically inherited, so there's no set way it can be inherited. The main deficiency seen here is hypoalpha-lipoproteinemia, which is characterized by deficiency of HDL cholesterol. Clinical features seen are increased cardiovascular risk. Low levels of HDL cholesterol are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Next, we have atherosclerosis. HDL is involved in the reverse cholesterol transport, removing cholesterol from peripheral tissues to the liver, preventing the formation of atherosclerotic plaques. Moving on to the next set of familial dyslipidemias. Almost done, guys. Okay. Familial dysbatiloproteinemia. This one is inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion. The main defect seen in it is apolipoprotein E deficiency or dysfunction. Clinical features involve elevated cholesterol, LDL, and triglyceride levels, formation of remnant lipoproteins, and Palmer xanthomas. This one is also known as type 3 hyperlipoproteinemia. Easier way to say than whatever familial dysbatiloproteinemia is. Same thing, but I like saying type 3 hyperlipoproteinemia more. Next, we have familial hypertriglyceridemia. This one is inherited mostly in an autosomal dominant fashion, but sometimes inherited polygenically as well. The main defect seen here is increased VLDL production. The clinical features seen are elevated triglyceride levels, increased risk of pancreatitis, and is associated with obesity, insulin resistance, and diabetes. This one is known as type 4 hyperlipoproteinemia as well. Then we have our more low yield set of dyslipidemias, but These are still fair game for CBSE in Step 1, so let's go ahead and cover them. Cytosterolemia. This one is inherited in a autosomal recessive fashion. The main defect seen here is mutations in the ABCG5 or ABCG8 transporter genes. The main clinical features observed are elevated levels of plant sterols, xanthomas, increased risk of premature atherosclerosis. Next, moving on to LCAT deficiency. LCAT stands for lectin cholesterol acetyltransferase. This one is inherited in autosomal recessive fashion. The main defect is LCAT enzyme deficiency. The clinical features seen here are low HDL cholesterol levels, accumulation of unesterified cholesterol in tissues, and potentially renal failure in some cases. So, can be very serious. Going on to our NBME application-based reasoning questions. So we have a 28-year-old male that presents with xanthomas on his Achilles tendons, elevated LDL cholesterol levels, and a family history of premature cardiovascular disease. Genetic testing reveals a mutation in the LDL receptor gene. What is most likely the diagnosis? We just covered this a few minutes ago. I'm expecting most of y'all to know this. Give you guys a few seconds to think it through. Alright, I'm moving on now. If you need to pause the video if you need more time. But moving on now. So the clinical presentation of xanthomas, elevated LDL cholesterol, and a family history of premature cardiovascular disease alongside mutation in the LDL receptor gene is characteristic of familial hypercholesterolemia, FH. This autosomal dominant disorder is caused by mutations affecting the LDL receptor, leading to impaired clearance of LDL cholesterol from the bloodstream. Xanthomas, particularly on the Achilles tendons, are a hallmark feature of familial hypercholesterolemia. Therefore, the answer is C, familial hypercholesterolemia, FH. Explaining why the other answer choices are wrong. Familial combined hyperlipidemia. Familial combined hyperlipidemia is characterized by elevated levels of both LDL cholesterol and triglycerides. The specific mutation in the LDL receptor gene points towards familial hypercholesterolemia, not familial combined hyperlipidemia. Familial hypertriglyceridemia. Familial hypercholesterolemia primarily involves elevated LDL cholesterol levels, not hypertriglyceridemia. The presence of xanthomas further supports the diagnosis of familial hypercholesterolemia. Familial dysbetolipoproteinemia. Dysbetolipoproteinemia is associated with impaired clearance of remnant lipoproteins and typically involves a defect in apolipoprotein E. The presentation in this case is more indicative of familial hypercholesterolemia. E. Familial hypoalpha-lipoproteinemia. Hypoalpha-lipoproteinemia is characterized by low HDL cholesterol levels, which is not the predominant feature in this case. The elevated LDL cholesterol in xanthomas suggest familial hypercholesterolemia. Moving on to the next question. A 14-year-old female presents with an LDL cholesterol level of 280 milligrams per deciliter, and her father died of a myocardial infarction in his early 40s. What is the most likely mechanism for this patient's condition? Give you guys a few more seconds to solve this through. Alright, should be enough time to solve this by now. Let's go ahead and move on to the answer. If you need more time, pause the video now. If not, I'm moving on. The elevated LDL cholesterol level and a family history of premature myocardial infarction are indicative of familial hypercholesterolemia, FH. The most common mechanism for familial hypercholesterolemia is a deficiency of LDL receptors leading to impaired clearance of LDL cholesterol from the bloodstream. This genetic disorder, often inherited in an autosomal dominant manner, results in elevated LDL cholesterol levels and an increased risk of cardiovascular events. Therefore, the correct answer is C, deficiency of LDL receptor. Let's see why the other answer choices are wrong. A, impaired synthesis of LDL cholesterol. Familial hypercholesterolemia is primarily characterized by impaired clearance of LDL cholesterol, not impaired synthesis. B, overproduction of VLDL cholesterol. Familial hypercholesterolemia is not associated with overproduction of VLDL cholesterol. The key defect is in the clearance of LDL cholesterol. D, enhanced activity of lipoprotein lipase. Lipoprotein lipase is involved in triglyceride metabolism, not LDL cholesterol clearance. This mechanism is not consistent with the presentation. E, mutation in apolipoprotein B100. While mutations in apolipoprotein B100 can contribute to familial hypercholesterolemia, the most direct mechanism involves a deficiency of LDL receptors, which is more specific to the clinical presentation described. Alright, that will do it for this review lesson, guys. Dyslipidemias, really hard to pronounce, but pretty easy to remember if you just get that down. Mostly you should just see the ones discussed in the review slides I put up and the ones seen in the questions. Very similar and mimic the NBME style. I found them in third-party Q banks and other sources, so very hard to pronounce. Very easy points to get on the test though. So please ensure that you got these down pretty well. And it should also help you in other organ blocks where hepatosplenomegaly is commonly seen, like in renal and GI, and potentially even cardio and palm if it's describing side effects. So yeah, keep that in mind, guys. If you can get this discipline down, you should get a strong foundation for your organ blocks as well. And sorry for mispronouncing a lot of words. It's hard to pronounce them, but easy to remember. Just that's my mantra for this topic. Anyways, guys, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. As always, this is FixerMed signing off. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.